So if we go back 250 years, education, as we know, was largely for wealthy families. So that's the answer to the first question, really. Who is education for? If we were living 250 years ago, most families were poor. Of course, there was no unemployment benefit, no national health service. Most people lived in the countryside. Children had to work to support their family. Everybody had to work in this situation unless you had your own financial means. Farm work needed only very basic skills. And because children were working in farm work, education really had little bearing on them. So the issue of special education, as it would have been then, really only related to children of the wealthy. Now, what happened? Well, from about 1760, in this country, the Industrial Revolution brought people into towns, and industrialization had a very strong influence on the way in which the government deemed that society should be organized, and more importantly, in lots of ways, should be controlled. Factories needed people who were able to cope with new technology. And of course, where that's the case, some children simply lacked skills to do this. I mean, we've all, I'm sure, read or seen films of Dickens' writings and other people's writings of children being sent up to clean the inside of chimneys or breaking their backs on looms and so on. But some children still lacked the skills to do it. So what should be done about this group? Inevitably, it became a very important issue. Now, the first special group, and again, we're talking about special schools, not special educational needs, because that term wasn't used until the Warnock Report in 1978. So back to the end of the 18th century, the first special group were the blind and the deaf. There was a school of instruction for so-called indigents, so for children of the poor, blind, in Liverpool, that was founded in 1791. Now, the founding papers of that particular school said that the school was intended to furnish the blind with employment that may prevent them from being burdens to their family and community. Considerations, actually, of what education for everybody, including those who experience particular difficulties, what education is for, has a very, very strong thread of as it says, furnishing children with the skills for employment. And I think, interestingly, if we zoom on nearly 200 years to the Warnock Report, it was Mrs. Thatcher who commissioned Mary Warnock and her committee to investigate and then write the report. And it says specifically in the introduction to the Warnock Report that Mrs. Thatcher wanted this to think about how children with special needs, as it became known, could be made employable. It was very much intended as a report, even 200 years after this, even to think about how to make children employable irrespective of their difficulties. Now, going back to that Liverpool school, men made baskets, tablecloths and whips. Women spun yarn, made sailcloths and picked oakum. That was a horrible job, picking oakum. It's untwisting old ropes from ships and boats and teasing out the fibres for shipbuilders to mix with tar to seal the lining, to make them waterproof, to seal the lining of wooden. It's very, very hard on the fingers. Horrible job. In 1825, there's a record in that Liverpool school visitors book of two boys being flogged for disobedience and being rude, and another one for stealing, making away with his yarns. There we are, the rather forbidding look of the School of Industry for the Indigent Blind in Liverpool. There was no provision, unless you were blind and deaf, and even so, most children didn't even get to those schools. There was no provision apart from workhouses and infirmaries with secure care for those children who experience serious difficulties in learning, unless, of course, the family was wealthy and could employ tutors. I picked out this quotation because it really illustrates the way that people felt about education at the beginning of the 19th century, and gives us a clue into thinking about which children were worth educating anyway. There was a Tory MP called Davies Giddy, who was reported in Hansard on the 13th of June 1807 as warning the House of Commons that giving education to the labouring classes of the poor would be found to be prejudicial to their morals and happiness. It would teach them to despise their lot in life instead of making them good servants in agriculture and other laborious employments to which their rank in society had destined them. Not because they deserved it or the wealthy deserved it, but that was their destination from God, if you like. So instead of teaching them subordination, which is what Davies Giddy thought education should do for children of the lower classes, it would render them factious and refractory. It would enable them, it would enable them to read seditious pamphlets, vicious books, and publications against Christianity. It would render them insolent to their superiors. So that was the view of who had the right to education at the beginning of the 19th century, and actually had serious implications for those who experienced difficulties of various sorts. Now, through the 19th century, there was pressure for compulsory primary education. The expansion, industry expanded, and as it did so, it required more, as they said, higher grades of workers and managers. In 1867, the Reform Act gave some people the vote, not women, of course, but some people the vote. So we've got some people arguing that children needed to be educated so that they could later on take on higher positions in factories and so on. We've got some MPs arguing that people needed to be educated in order to vote. But also there's another issue, which was that with increasing influxes of people coming from the countryside into towns and cities looking for work, it was illegal for children under 9 to work. So what are you going to do with them? 1870 Education Act. Primary education became compulsory for almost all children. And paragraph 5 of the 1878 Elementary Education Act, chapter 75, says, there shall be provided for every school district a sufficient amount of accommodation in public elementary schools available for all the children resident in such district. The issue is, though, if you go from very few schools, apart from those that have been founded, for example, by charities or churches or whatever, so very few schools, to everybody now has to be educated, that there is insufficient room anyway in the schools that were available, and insufficient teachers to teach everybody. So what again are we going to do with children who experience difficulties? Now, with the development of industry, there are kind of parallel streams running along here. With the development of industry came an interest in science and medicine. One focus, talking now about the middle of the 19th century, one focus was human biology. A range of prominent scientists, including Sir Francis Galton, who was a cousin, I think interestingly, of Charles Darwin. So a range of prominent scientists developed the notion of eugenics. Eugenics meaning well-born, having good genes. Now, the aim of the eugenics movement was to improve the characteristics of a race by promoting certain qualities in its children, which they then would pass on to future generations. A belief then that intelligence is inborn, and so is criminality, for example. Galton and his colleagues believed that certain attributes were necessary to meet the new demands of the industrialized society. So you've got all these people coming into towns, and you've got all sorts of things going on, good, bad, and indifferent, which have not necessarily been so obvious before. And Galton and his colleagues believed that particular physical, social, and intellectual attributes were needed for the developing industrialist society. First of all, good physical health, good physique, intelligence, social usefulness, freedom from genetic traits. I think the last two are interesting. Well, they're all interesting, but odd. Being a member of a large, well-adjusted family. I guess if you come from a family that is clearly well-adjusted, then you're going to be okay if you believe in this inheritance issue. And having a fondness for animals. Well, Galton's belief, and fundamental to eugenics, is that human intelligence is innate. As we know, there's been a lot of debate in psychology for a very long time now about whether intelligence and various other characteristics of human beings, whether they are inborn or whether they develop as a result of the context in which we live and experience life. So Galton's belief then, human intelligence was innate. A single unit of inheritance passed through the generations of the same family occurred unchangingly. But the environment really made very little difference. Now, if you believe that intelligence is innate, by definition, parents of high intelligence are going to give birth to children also with high levels of intelligence, and parents of low intelligence will have children of low intelligence. So what are we going to do about making sure that society is as pure and functioning as well as it possibly can? The problem of what to do was linked to many of society's social problems. Now, instead of thinking about social problems as inherently linked to the conditions in which one finds oneself, it was linked to social problems were also, it was believed that they were also inherited through families. So there is another fundamental belief here, which is that nature favors the survival of coarser, he called them coarser, social groups that spoilt the quality of population. I don't mean to go over the top in terms of current politics in the USA in particular, but I was struck a few weeks ago when I heard Donald Trump talk about the influx of immigrants poisoning the blood of Americans. And I thought, this goes straight back to, there's such a direct link between the issue of eugenics in 19th century society and current beliefs in certain groups poisoning society. Now, Galton believed then that coarser social groups were favored by nature, so would survive in greater quantities if nobody did anything about it. If nobody intervenes, there will be a disaster in society. And this led to a consideration politically, to a consideration of what they thought of as the health of the nation. Where an individual could not contribute to society, society had a right not to care for them and a right to get rid of them. The result in this belief was the introduction of eugenic controls to limit the number of people reproduced in a degenerate population, as they saw poor people who were linked to low intelligence and criminality, and the introduction of controls to increase the numbers of intellectual members whose physique was sound as they saw it. So here we begin segregation into specialized institutions for those deemed unfit. This happened to adults, and if we come into the education system, it happened to children. The solution in education then was to measure and to identify. I think this worry about assessment and the results of assessment and what it means for particular groups, that issue, as I said, and the concern about it has kind of, resounded, if you like, had resonances through the years in education. Now, the new discipline of psychology that was growing at the end of the 18th century made formal identification and assessment of deficiencies in children seem legitimate, where you have this belief in eugenics and the importance of cleansing society of those that you really don't want, then looking at the way in which psychology was developing and was being brought into education, it makes, as I put here, the assessment of deficiencies as they were seen seem legitimate. It's okay to do that. So what do we do with lower achieving children? Then we have the introduction of compulsory education in 1870, which was extended in 1880, extended and reinforced really 10 years later in 1880. How do we cope with lower achieving children? Well, one of the issues is that national funding for schools from the government then depended partly on the outcomes of examinations of pupils by school inspectors coming into schools, primary schools, children being educated up to the age of 10 or 11, and seeing how many children were as competent as could be expected in the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Payment by results had been introduced just before education became compulsory. It was introduced in 1863. The thing is, once you introduce something like that, it's a bit like competition between schools these days and league tables. The less able are now less desirable in a school. And interestingly, I think that policy was actually abandoned in 1890 because they realised how detrimental it was to schools. Now, if we just look at the example of Down syndrome. Down syndrome, first described in detail by John Langdon Down in the middle of the 19th century, 1866. He wrote a paper called Observations on an Ethnic Classification of Idiots. Owing to his perception that children with Down syndrome shared physical facial similarities, the epicanthal folds, with those of the Mongolian race. It was John Langdon Down who introduced the term Mongoloid. And certainly when I was young, children with Down syndrome were commonly called Mongols, leading to a lot of upset, negative thinking, and so on. And attitudes, I mean, it was a long time. If we go back, he wrote that paper in 1866, used the term Mongoloid. It was 100 years until that changed. And attitudes about Down syndrome were very closely tied to racism, really until the 19th century. First half of the 20th century and the rise of the eugenics movement, as in the first half, a number of countries, including some states in the United States of America, began programs of compulsory sterilization of individuals with Downs. It's a continuation of the eugenics movement. Let's remove from society, let's not allow those that we really don't regard very highly, let's take away their right to have children. So forced sterilization of individuals, this eugenics approach. In Nazi Germany, Action T4 was a program of the systematic murder of individuals with Down syndrome and other comparable disabilities. It wasn't just people of the Jewish religion, it was other people as well. Now, if we come back to Down syndrome, in 1961, 18 geneticists wrote to the editor of the publication, the very famous international publication, The Lancet, saying that Mongolian idiocy, I mean, how are you supposed to feel if your child is called a Mongolian idiot? You know, what does that mean about us as a society if we are treating other people's children or they are treating our children in this way? So 18 geneticists wrote to The Lancet and said, got to stop this. That term has misleading connotations. It's become an embarrassing term and it must be changed. The Lancet supported the term Down syndrome. Down in the United States, Downs in this country. And the World Health Organization officially dropped references to Mongolism it took 4 years to Mongolism in 1965 after a request by the Mongolian delegate. Took a lot of pressure to drop references to that particular term. Now, to go back to the end of the 19th century, I just brought it forward to see how terminology and ways of thinking about and talking about children who experience barriers to learning or whatever of various sorts, these things just carry on echoing down the years. Now, in 1896, in this country, there was a committee on defective and epileptic children that recommended 3 classes then. Now we've got psychology coming into play. We can measure, so we thought, measure and assess and so on. Those categorized as feeble-minded should be educated in special schools. Those categorized as imbeciles should be admitted to asylums, and those children identified in the category of idiots were not educable. It was actually the beginning of the 1970s when the law changed to say that every child had a right to education. So it's a long time later that all children were deemed to be able to benefit from some level of education. There was a Mental Deficiency Act in 1913. One of the issues that I was looking at fairly recently was the way in which what happened in this country in the organisation of education and the politics of it all was translated into colonies, our British colonies, and exactly the same things. For example, I looked at New Zealand, and exactly the same was happening in New Zealand about the categorization of children and people in society and marginalization and placement in institutions away from everybody else so that people couldn't reproduce. There was a Mental Deficiency Act in 1911 in New Zealand, for example, which had the same kind of definition and categorization. Anyway, 1913, the Mental Deficiency Act defined 4 grades of mental defectives then: idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded. And there's another category called moral imbeciles, so a linking of criminality with difficulties in learning and understanding. There were only 3 MPs in Parliament who voted against the bill when it went through. One of them, Josiah Wedgwood, who was one of the ancestors of the Labour MP Tony Benn, Josiah Wedgwood said, "It's a spirit of the horrible eugenic society that's setting out to breed up the working class as though they were cattle." There was a continued rise of educational psychology and the belief in the possibility of measuring intelligence. And it carried on through the first half of the 20th century. After the 1913 Act, in special education, things stayed the same approximately till World War II. In the 1930s, there was a move towards considering how to restructure the system of education for everybody, and that included those children who were considered to be educable only in special schools. And there was a major Education Act, as we know, in 1944 to reconsider the education of all children. It was after this that we had the development of grammar schools, secondary moderns, and so on. But that was not an act that came as a result of regulations afterwards. It was not actually in the Act itself. The Act itself said we've got to consider how best to structure the education for all children in this country.